Good evening. I'm Satish Kumar Jha, and today's discussion we are going to have on political thought of Swami Vivekanand. In fact, Vivekanand is one such thinker of modern India who has been interpreted in multiple ways over the years because of the range of issues which he covered through his political engagement, philosophical engagement in course of his journey, both social, philosophical and political. Of course, it is to be remembered that Vivekanand is often referred as a philosopher and less of a political activist, and he also tried to keep himself away from the political activism, but nonetheless entire discourse of Indian nationalism remains incomplete without reference to Vivekanand and his political thought. So therefore, when we discuss a thinker like Vivekanand, we have had we get number of issues to discuss, to reflect on, and particularly from the point of view of today's India, particularly from the point of view of nationalism, from the point of view of social change, social reforms, and number of interrelated issues. He comes to us as a very resourceful thinker. Now, one thing we should remember that Vivekanand, whose original name was Narendranath Dutt, was born in 1863 and he died in 1902. He had a very short span of life of approximately 40 years, and during this 40 years the kind of ground which he covered, both in terms of his philosophical engagement and political discourses, in fact that is really commendable. In fact, as I mentioned at the very outset, that Vivekanand's political thought has been interpreted in multiple ways. There is a lot of debate about the nature of his engagement. For many scholars, he was just a speculative monk, and he was simply trying to reflect on on religious spiritual issues, and therefore he doesn't have much to contribute on political and social issues. On the other hand, there is also a school of thought which believes that he was a social crusader, and therefore his ideas, his views, his opinion on number of issues deserve close scrutiny and close analysis. For some other scholars, he was a fiery patriot who interpreted Vedantic philosophy, Vedanta, as a school of thought or a school of philosophy, and also believed that Vedanta was the only philosophical truth through which people could get real salvation. In fact, he is also at times referred as someone who believed in a political project of a nation and nationalism, particularly at a stage when nationhood was advancing at a rapid speed. In fact, one of his follower, Sister Nivedita, in fact argued that he was intensely patriotic without being political. So therefore, in fact, she is trying to make a distinction between patriotism and political, that for being patriotic one doesn't have to be political. And in fact, Vivekanand fits the bill nicely, because his entire argument was influenced, or one can say that colored by his patriotism, by his nationalism. Of course, there is a difference between patriotism and nationalism, because nationalism is a modern ideology, whereas patriotism is as old as human existence. Particularly, it is believed that patriotism is something territorial, something which has less to do with the modern ideology of nationalism. So therefore, in the opinion of Sister Nivedita, he was intensely patriotic, but he was not political. Political in the sense normally we believe in, but political in the sense that the Indian nationalists, particularly during freedom movement, were engaging with this issue. political in the sense that the way whole host of nationalist opinion was rising in revolt against the colonial power. That way, of course, he was not political, but nonetheless there is no denying the fact that some of the ideas which he espoused had a lot of political overtone, in the sense that when he talked of basically reforming society, when he talked of reforming religion, when he talked of reforming of number of spheres of social and cultural life which were afflicted by number of ills. In fact, he was being political, because the political project at that time had to include all these issues, and this is what perhaps social religious reform movement in India from the days of Ram Mohan Roy and even later tried to convey. And in fact, even in 20th century, the great nationalists like Gandhi, Ambedkar and others who continued that tradition of social and political reform tried to convey the same masses. But nonetheless, one thing is often argued, that Vivekanand was not political in the sense that he was not a member of any political organization. In fact, he was very critical of Indian National Congress, particularly its mendicancy. I will get the opportunity to discuss more about this. So, therefore, these are some of the issues which comes into the debate, particularly when we discuss Vivekanand and his social and political thought. One thing is also important, that Vivekanand, particularly in terms of his philosophical journey, covered a lot of ground, in the sense that he started like an ordinary middle class youth of Bengal. His father in fact was a successful lawyer whose name was Vishwanath Dutt. In fact, he came from a progressive family, because Vishwanath Dutt himself had a very progressive view about number of issues, including the education for women. In fact, in terms of the class and caste background, one can say that Vivekanand came from upper class and upper caste background. In fact, he came from a Hindu caste called Kaists, who was of course upper in the hierarchy, but of course was not considered a caste which was basically entitled for the interpretation of religious scriptures and religious doctrines. And therefore, he also drew a lot of criticism from the orthodox Hindu opinion later, when he tried to give a new interpretation to Hinduism, particularly in terms of universalistic values, pluralistic values and so on and so forth. So, therefore, in fact, that issue was always there, that he came from the upper caste, upper class background, but he was not considered to be someone from the priestly class. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, that his lifespan was for a period less than 40 years. One can say in a very short span of time, Vivekananda tried to reflect on the issues which basically were very important for Indian society, for Indian people, and for regeneration, a spiritual regeneration of Indian civilization. So, therefore, these things are to be remembered when we discuss of course Vivekanand's political thought. And one thing is to be remembered, that Vivekanand's political thought would remain incomplete without without reference to his guru Ramakrishna Paramhans, who was not only a great source of influence on him, much more than perhaps his father or the progressive milieu of his family. In fact, Ramakrishna Paramhans, who initiated him into this Vedantic school of philosophy, the Vedant, and in hands of Vivekananda, that Vedant became something more profound, a practical Vedant, a kind of interpretation which he offered to this Vedantic philosophy, that is non-dualism, in fact has become monumental in terms of the philosophical contribution of India. So, therefore, these are some of the important issues to be remembered when we discuss life and times of a thinker, because as we are aware about one thing, that when we discuss the political thought of a thinker, in fact his upbringing or her upbringing, the social milieu in which the entire evolution of that thought takes place becomes important for a scholar. So is the case with Vivekanand, that what was the context, what was the background, the social background of his ideas and his knowledge, and therefore both his family, his father, the progressive milieu of his family, along with the influence of his master, his guru, the Ramakrishna Paramhans, becomes very important. But one thing is to be remembered, that Vivekananda, of course, as scholars often point out, didn't have a very bright career, but nonetheless one thing is to be remembered, that he was exposed to Western philosophy in the same proportion as he was perhaps exposed to Eastern philosophy, particularly Indian philosophy. In fact, he was quite familiar with the ideas and writings of utilitarians, Auguste Comte, John Stuart Mill, Spencer. Particularly, he was basically at some stage he came under the influence of agnostic philosophy of John Stuart Mill, but of course he disagreed with him and deviated from that agnosticism, because he never believed in overthrowing the concept of God and religion, and these two things became very important in his philosophical journey. Now, it is in this context that we have to see particularly the influence of Ramakrishna Paramhans, his master, his guru, in whose honor or in order to carry forward his legacy and tradition, he established a Ramakrishna mission or a mutt, particularly in Balur in Calcutta, which was not far off from Dakshineshwar Kali temple, which was basically the place where Ramakrishna often could be seen, or he was associated with that temple as a high priest. So therefore, Ramakrishna's influence, both in terms of initiating Vivekananda into this Vedanta school of philosophy, as well as the kind of ascetic orientation which Vivekananda developed, could be attributed to the influence of Ramakrishna Paramhans, whose time period, of course, was in fact in the 19th century, and Ramakrishna became a very important personality in 19th century, particularly in context of colonial exploitation, in terms of the miseries and degradation of the middle class in Bengal, the kind of degradation and the indignities which the middle class started suffering in hands of colonial state. Ramakrishna and his particularly discourses attracted a lot of lower middle class and the middle class people to his sermons and to his discourses, and it was in this context that Ramakrishna was a very important name in Bengal at that time when Vivekananda joined his ashram. In fact, it was Ramakrishna who initiated Vivekananda in the mysticism of Advaita Vedanta. In fact, this Advaita Vedanta in the hands of particularly Swami Vivekananda, but also to some extent Ramakrishna, was part philosophy, but also a mystical point of view that took all differentiation in this world, including human and non-human, to be relatively real. In fact, this differentiation was perhaps at the heart of this entire discourse of Vedanta, which is also at times referred as a non-dualist school in philosophy, non-dualism, because it is believed that all creatures, both the creatures and the creator, are basically the one. It believes in the doctrine of oneness. It believes that man and the God are no different, because the creature and the creator are part of the same process. In fact, this Brahm, this entire monism, the discourse on monism, the monistic school of philosophy as it is often referred. In fact, of course, India had a long tradition of this Vedanta school of philosophy, or Advaitvad as it is called, Advait, non-dualism, starting with the Shankar, the late early medieval philosopher, and then subsequently to some extent even Ram Mohan Roy also tried to propagate the same philosophy. But in hands of Vivekanand and his guru Ramakrishna, this the Vedant, Advaita Vedant became a very powerful tool to basically regenerate both spiritually, socially and philosophically the decaying Indian society, Indian culture, Indian tradition. So therefore, this entire Advaita Vedant believed that all differentiation in the world to be the only relatively real. Man in this view is not different from God. In fact, whatever difference appears to the beholder is largely on account of the delusion that does not allow to gauge the that supreme truth. That truth is that the Almighty, or one can say that Brahm or Brahmanand. So therefore, in fact, this Brahmanand, the idea of Brahmanand, which includes three different type of guna, and this three guna, the equal and very harmonious balance of the guna, in fact this school believes that also is there in this entire Brahmanand. Of course, human beings also, men and women also have those gunas, but the thing is that this kind of harmony among the three gunas in fact are not to be seen in human beings in the same proportion as perhaps the Brahmanand, that Almighty, or one can say the supreme reality, or one can say that Brahm. And therefore, the human beings, when attains that harmony among the guna, then perhaps one can get the moksha. So therefore, it was a very very intense philosophical discourse of Advaita Vedanta, the philosophical monism, and it was translated by Vivekanand into some sort of universalism and social egalitarianism, and that was perhaps his singular achievement and contribution. In fact, this universalism and social egalitarianism, in fact to some extent one can say the kind of pluralism which was basically brought into this discourse, was the greatest contribution which he made, particularly at a time when the sectarian politics was raising its head in India, particularly in colonial context. Society was getting fragmented. Religion, particularly Hinduism, was afflicted with a lot of evil practices. Society was in grips of many superstition, ignorance, and so on and so forth. It was in this context that he tried to reinterpret Hinduism with the help of this Vedantic philosophy, Advaita Vedanta, and took this in direction of universalism and social egalitarianism by attacking both the caste practices like untouchability, the degradation of Sudras, the degradation and indignities which the women suffered here, and therefore in fact this was something a singular achievement of Vivekanand. In fact, this entire thing, what I believe was Vivekanand's contribution was this creative interpretation of this Vedantic school of philosophy, particularly Advaita Vedanta, particularly in direction of universalism and social egalitarianism. In fact, the death of Ramakrishna, his guru, in the year 1886 was a turning moment in the evolution of Vivekanand's philosophical and political journey. In fact, when Ramakrishna had initiated 11 men into his ashram, or particularly into the sannyas, in fact he also tried to organize them into a monastic order, monastery, which was later on turned into reality by Vivekananda when he founded Ramakrishna Mission or Ramakrishna Math, as I made mention to this earlier. In fact, what happened that out of these 11 men who were initiated by Ramakrishna into this monastic order, in fact some of them went on to pilgrimage, other devoted their time to socially useful projects, but one person called Narendranath, who later on became Vivekanand, in fact started on a different trajectory altogether. In fact, in 1890, he basically decided to take the path of wanderings, what is normally referred in Indian tradition as parivraj, that is the unsettled itinerary, particularly of Hindu ascetics, in fact, who decided not to camp at one place for a long period. Rather, they stayed very briefly, only briefly, at a particular place under this order, that is the parivraj, and Vivekanand decided to undertake that parivraj. In fact, what happened, he took a very extensive tour of India, just to know the conditions of Indian society, Indian people. And in other words, one can say that he was interested in taking the pulse of the Indian people. In fact, here one is reminded of Gandhi. When Gandhi came from South Africa in 1915, the first thing he did, of course, was extensive tour of India to see the conditions through his own eyes, that in what condition the people in India lived. And only after seeing India through his own eyes, that Gandhi decided to chalk out his entire strategy, his political strategy, his reflection on the problems of his time. So therefore, before Gandhi, in fact, when we hear about this parivraj of Vivekanand, one is reminded of a similar action on the part of this thinker, this philosopher, who did it. Now, during this tour, it is believed that Vivekanand encountered 3-4 problems which left a lasting impression on his mind. One was the poverty, which was basically being faced by Indian people. The another problem was disability, and the third was the problem of disease, the kind of conditions in which Indian people lived and the kind of miseries which they suffered completely shattered Vivekanand, along with one problem which he not only highlighted but also decided to fight through his philosophical engagement, through his political reflections, was the dominance and the control which superstition and ignorance had on the minds of the people. So therefore, these 3-4 issues which he observed during his extensive tour of India, particularly after the death of his guru, particularly when he decided to take this parivraj, the wanderings, life of wanderer, not a fixed destination, just to move from place to place to see the conditions of people and the society. So therefore, on basis of this, Vivekanand in fact realized that what India needed at that time was the knowledge, and knowledge both secular and spiritual, because what he believed, that the secular knowledge would enable Indians to understand the phenomenal world, whereas the spiritual knowledge would lead to some sort of awakening. It will basically restore self-belief. It will also make them aware about the potential greatness inherent in each individual. So therefore, this education was emphasized by Vivekanand even later, which was based on the kind of situation which he encountered during his extensive tour to India, where he believed that superstition and ignorance could be countered only through a better knowledge, better education, and therefore education he basically emphasized to great extent. In fact, instead of blaming religion for all the ills which afflicted India, in fact, interestingly, Vivekanand tried to turn religion into the vehicle for upliftment of the downtrodden. He wanted to turn or use religion as a vehicle for new awakening, new awareness, and thereby he tried to reform religion. In fact, one is reminded here that even in 20th century, in fact, there are many instances where religion was tried to be made the vehicle of liberation, particularly in Latin American countries when we hear of liberation theology. In India, there are a number of instances. For example, as we know that for Gandhi, religion was a very important part of human life. In fact, truth and God, he often basically equated with each other. For him, religion is not only faith. For Gandhi, religion was also ethics. Religion was also code of conduct. Religion was also philosophy. So therefore, he didn't want to detach human beings from religion and religious orientation. So in fact, there are many instances. Even Ambedkar, who was a great critique of in the Indian social order, particularly in terms of the inequality and the indignity which were basically heaped on a large number of people, but later on converted to Buddhism. Of course, Buddhism he considered a rational philosophy, rational religion which was based on rationalism, and thereby believed that a religion provides a very important link to human emancipation and human liberation. So what basically I am trying to argue here, that during that period there are many instances when religion was made important vehicle of liberation and emancipation, and Vivekanand's example is another important reference here, because he understood the limitations, he understood the hollowness of Indian society. He in fact believed, or rather he could see that how religion was wrongly interpreted, and religion was responsible for many social and cultural degradation and distortions, but nonetheless he never wanted to throw religion out of the life of human beings. So therefore his entire argument was in direction of regeneration, of a spiritual regeneration of Indian society, and it is with this mission that he also established a monastery, that is Ramakrishna Mission, Ramakrishna Mutt at Belur in Calcutta, which I mentioned earlier also. So therefore it was in this context that we find that altogether a different type of a reflection we find in the thought of Vivekanand so far as social, political and philosophical issues in India are concerned. One thing is to be remembered, that in fact when we talk of Vivekanand and his political thought, we encounter particularly one issue, that is the issue of renunciation and sannyas. Because as I mentioned that at times it is argued that Vivekanand didn't have much to contribute on political issues. It is true that he was a great critique of political action, particularly initiated by Indian National Congress, particularly the kind of route they had adopted, kind of method they had adopted in his time, what is often referred as mendicancy. But at the same time one should also remember that his entire discourse on society, on culture, on spiritual issues, on a spiritual regeneration had a political overtone, because the entire thing was meant to regenerate Indian society. Because in fact, as it is often argued that the two things which he identified through his ideas and writings responsible for India's problem, one was colonialism, the British colonial state, and another was basically the social practices, superstition, ignorance, the caste system, the degeneration of Indian culture, and therefore these twin issues which he identified at the root cause of Indian problem, and therefore how to deal with them. And it is in this context that we have to see this entire idea of sannyas and renunciation. In fact, we should remember one thing, that renunciation or sannyas has a long tradition in India. In fact, earlier of course it was believed that the sannyasis, particularly those saints, those sadhus, hermits, those who take sannyas or renounce the world, they leave the society and go to hills and forests. They don't engage with the social life, social and political life. To some extent one can say that Ramakrishna's notion of sannyas was also of this kind. But in hands of Vivekanand, this entire idea of sannyas and renunciation underwent a significant change, and this change was that from ascetic retreat of a sannyasi, he turned into an ethical engagement with social and political situation of the people. So, this entire engagement, ethical engagement with social political situation of people was a major transmutation of this entire concept of renunciation and sannyas. Lot of people believed that this entire mutations started with Ram Mohan Roy, and of course later we can also see in the hands of Gandhi. In between stands Vivekanand, because Ram Mohan Roy for the first time started arguing that the real liberation or the salvation or the purpose of spiritualism and religion is in terms of engaging with the social challenges and political challenges, when he started the Brahmo Samaj and other things. But in hands of Ramakrishna, particularly in the hands of Vivekanand, this transmutation, or one can say that this mutation of this entire concept was really very profound, because there are number of statements of Vivekanand where he says that the job of a sadhu is not to go to the forest or the hills and to meditate. Rather, the job of a true sadhu or sannyasi is to live in the society, among the people, among the in the miseries of the people, and fight with them the root cause of their miseries. So, therefore, here we find that this entire concept of renunciation and sannyas, from ascetic retreat, which was perhaps the practice earlier in Indian tradition, to a new interpretation, that is the creative engagement with social reality, was something very novel in the hands of Vivekanand. So, therefore, the sannyas and renunciation, one can say, is important here. Now, coming to this Parliament of Religion, 11 September 1893. Now, this Parliament of Religion, which he participated in United States of America, Chicago, completely transformed the stature of Vivekanand, not only in India but world over, when he became a great celebrity, particularly after that Chicago address, because in this address what he tried was to present the universalistic face of Hinduism to the larger world, and thereby also tried to convey masses to the believers and the followers of this religion, that Hinduism stood for brotherhood, Hinduism stood for universalism, pluralism, and sectarianism did not have any place in this religion. So, therefore, this entire Vedantic Advaitavad, the non-dualism which I mentioned earlier, was basically the basis on which he interpreted religion. In fact, one thing is also to be remembered, that Vivekanand was one thinker who always believed that that the East and West have to take from each other, because materialism of the West is perhaps becoming too excessive, and therefore it has to borrow the spiritualism from the East, and similarly the spiritualism of the East has to harmonize itself with some of the values and the achievements of the West, particularly on material side. And it is in this context that Vivekananda often referred to Japan, the case of Japan, because how creatively the Japan harmonized the two things, the modernity of the West and the indigenous culture, and the values of tradition of the people and the society, and by this creatively harmonizing the two things, the materialist modernity of the West and the traditional cultural values of the Japanese society. In fact, Japan heralded a new era, the modern era. Now, of course, he made a distinction between Japan and India on account of the fact that India was under an alien rule, the Britishers, and therefore it did not allow the luxury to such harmony, because harmonizing the two things, the modern values and the traditional values, because of the colonial exploitation, because the colonization of mind. What happened, that Indian people always looked with suspicion and skepticism toward the Western values, toward the Western dominance, where it was being seen as an attempt to impose particular set of values, both religious, social and cultural, on a society which they were ruling over. So therefore, it was a different type of situation in India in the in the opinion of Vivekanand, because the alien was ruling over here, an alien ruler who never considered itself to be the part of this society, and it is here he thought that was the difference between the medieval rulers, who came from outside India, but they became part of the Indian society. But this British rule never replicated such instances in history. So therefore, this Parliament of Religion was a very important event in the life of Vivekanand, because what happened that here he tried to engage with the larger world and tried to also convey to the world that what masses India had to offer for them, particularly through its religion and through its philosophy. That is the message of brotherhood and universalism. Of course, now coming to the issue of the reflections on the contemporary India, or reflections on the India of his time, particularly from the point of view of social and political problems. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, that he believed that the two issues were interrelated, the colonial exploitation and the degeneration of society, and both had to be fought head on, because colonial exploitation was order of the day and degeneration of society was in a problem which was basically of its own making, and therefore one has to address both issues simultaneously. And it is here that he started attacking the caste system, he attacking various evil practices in the society, and it is here that he also started critiquing this entire social reform movement in India, particularly reform movement like widow remarriage, sati system and other things, because he believed that these social reform movements or the issues which they highlighted were largely colored by upper class background of its leaders and the protagonists, because they only picked up issues which pertain to the upper class and the upper caste of the society, and therefore these movements didn't address the main concerns of the people, of the masses, because for him unless the awakening of masses takes place, in fact no nationhood can be created, no nationalist politics can take root. And this was one of the criticism of Indian National Congress which he offered, because he believed that thousands of educated Indians cannot make a nation. A nation can be built only when masses can be integrated with this politics, and therefore how masses can be awakened. And it is in this context that he started critiquing the social reform movement in India, which was of course mostly upper class oriented, be it the sati system, widow remarriage and many other issues. And he started taking up those issues which were ignored earlier by this social reform movement. In fact, it is here that we also see that how he developed a mistrust for the rich and also started empathizing with the poor, particularly those who were totally disprivileged, dispossessed and suffering at the bottom of the society. Now one thing we should remember, that it is this Vedantic, Advait Vedantic philosophy of Vivekanand which basically influenced his entire idea of oneness of human problem, because what he believed, that contentment is not matter of class. In fact, he also argued that the poor people sometimes become more contented than the rich, and therefore in fact he believed that it is always important to know the psyche of the disprivileged, dispossessed and the poor. In fact, he also argued that spiritual talks if given to the people with empty stomach, it will not be palatable, because they will simply detest it. Therefore, it is also important that if you want to raise the level of spiritual growth of people, their belly should be full. So, therefore, in fact, it was in this context that we find that how at times Vivekanand is also referred as a thinker who engaged with the question of socialism. In fact, Vivekanand himself said that he was a socialist in the sense that he believed in this egalitarianism, in basically the rights of the poor and the masses. But his socialism was different. He did not want to completely liquidate the rich or liquidate the upper echelons of the society. Rather, he wanted the lower echelons to rise to that level. So, therefore, in fact, that was the difference. He did not believe in class struggle the way perhaps the communists and the socialists argued in different parts of the world. He rather believed in class harmony. In fact, he distanced himself from organized politics, but of course, he never hesitated in criticizing the mendicancy of the Congress, as I mentioned earlier also. He emphasized on the rousing of the masses. In fact, the Japan-India comparison I have already mentioned, that how he made reference to Japan and India in order to basically flag this point, that harmonizing modern values of the West, through which they have achieved number of things in civilization, the growth, the growth, civilizational growth, as well as the material growth, as well as the spiritual dimensions of Indian society and the Eastern society. Unless that harmony is created, in fact, you cannot say that human beings will be raising its spiritual growth. So, therefore, in fact, the ideas and the thought of Vivekananda are so intricate, so complex, so comprehensive, that it becomes difficult to basically put under one rubric, whether he was a nationalist, whether he was a social reformer, whether he was a system builder, whether he was a sadhu, whether he was a a sannyasi, because his ideas were not articulated or not presented in form of a professional trained political philosopher, but nonetheless it covered whole range of issues. For example, his thought on nation, when he said that social inequality and nation building in fact cannot go together. Unless you address the question of social inequality, this bonding, the national bonding, the nationhood cannot be created. In fact, he also argued that the social problems are always the biggest hurdle of nation building, and it is in this context that what later V.R. Ambedkar also talked in 20th century, when he was talked about Indian nation, Indian democracy and in emancipation of the people. So, therefore, in fact, there are many issues on which we find that in 20th century number of social reformers, political activists, those who believed in emancipation, in fact took this discourse forward in a different way, not perhaps in the same language as Vivekanand perhaps articulated, the language of renunciation or in the language of Advaita Vedanta. In fact, on education, his reflections were very insightful. He believed that education was the important tool for regeneration. In fact, critique of social reform, I have already said that he believed that it was basically loaded in favor of the upper classes of India. In fact, education, on issue of education, he made a very apt comparison between India and United States of America, because we must remember one thing, that the Chicago address which he delivered in this Parliament of Religion was not the only trip which he made to USA. In fact, even in 1899, he took another journey to Europe and United States of America, and later on he started making a comparison that why is it that the great people in United States, when they die immediately, a replacement happens, but in India it does not happen so soon, simply because we have deprived large number of people from the right to be educated. We are not allowing them to get exposed to new ideas. We are not allowing the masses to partake in this entire process, and therefore, in fact, he believed that education is a very important tool for reform, for regeneration, for the growth. In fact, on law and reform, because at that time, this time is also remembered as a period when many legislations were made for social reform. He had reservation on a law as a medium for reform, because he believed that ultimately who is making law, and since the lawmakers were not Indians, the law making process was not in the hands of the Indians, this entire reform had limited value for a society like India. Now, but on basis of these things, we can also say that Vivekananda is not immune from criticisms. There are a lot of criticisms which are leveled against him. The most important criticism today is that the kind of sectarian nationalism which has developed in India over the years by using religion as the vehicle of nationalism was basically initiated by Vivekananda, particularly the way he tried to Semitize Hinduism, the way he tried to essentialize Hinduism. In fact, the critics point out that Vivekananda's thought at times are contradictory in nature. On the one hand, he talks of universalism, pluralism of Hinduism. On the other hand, he also tried to essentialize it, and this essentializing of this identity and religion was an attempt in this direction of giving birth to this sectarian nationalism, which later on culminated into this discourse of Hindutva. So, this is one of the criticism which is often levelled against Vivekananda. Similarly, there are many other criticisms also, particularly the way he created this Ramakrishna mission, the Ramakrishna Mutt, because it was argued that Hinduism as a religion did not have any organized structure, and therefore, by imitating this Western religion, particularly the Semitic religion, must have militated against the spirit of this religion which he wanted to reform. So, there are many criticisms, but there is no running away from the fact that he was one of the leading voice at a time when India required a kind of reformer who spoke the language of religion and language of a renouncer, and thereby touched the inner core of Indian culture, Indian tradition and Indian people. He was a great reformer, particularly in terms of the new interpretation and creative interpretation of religion, particularly in terms of brotherhood, pluralism and universalism. So, it is in this context that we have to assess and analyze the thought of Vivekananda.